to another episode of the Sound of Economics Live from Bruegel, the Bruegel-based economics think tank. We are almost 2 weeks now into the Ukrainian war, and the world, and certainly European countries, look in disbelief at the unnecessary loss of human life, the destruction of people's livelihoods, and the erosion of institutions. In today's episode, we take stock on how Russia's economy fares now, 2 weeks into this war, what are its economic prospects immediately and in the longer run, and look for an answer to the question that is in everybody's mind: when will it end? I'm Maria Demergis, and together with Bruegel's director, Guntram Wolf, we are delighted to welcome our guest for this morning, Professor Sergei Guriev, a professor at Sciences Po in Paris, and previously the chief economist at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Guntram, Sergei, a very good morning to you both. Perhaps I could kickstart the discussion. Sergei, you have given many presentations in the past 2 weeks, many interventions in the press. You have attempted to explain to us all the economic implications of the conflict that we see right now. Perhaps we can start with taking stock where we are now, given that the information changes very, very rapidly. How do you see the economic implications? And can you give us a sense on where we stand today?
Thank you very much, Marie, for inviting me, and it's a great pleasure to be here with you and with Guntram. Before starting talking about economics, I should tell you that in recent events, a lot of economists start their economic discussions with a statement that economists also have hearts, and what's happening is really, really tragic. You mentioned the question, what is happening to Russian economy? I'll actually give you a date. I will say that Russian economy is 1990 or 1991, but when we think about Ukraine and Europe in general, we are probably talking about 1939. And in that sense, of course, what we are going through is a great tragedy. And I think it's a great time to remind people that Putin's not Russia, and Putin's war is not Russia's war. And as a Russian, I should tell you that yesterday with a famous ballet dancer Mikhail Baryshnikov and a famous Russian writer Boris Akunin, we launched an initiative called True Russia, where we will fundraise among Russian diaspora to help Ukrainian refugees. So please go to the website truerussia.org. Now, going back to your question, in terms of economic impact, everything is changing every day. And this is why you mentioned that I give a lot of talks, and that is really exhausting, but it's also true that you cannot just give one talk and say, go back to my talk from 2 weeks ago or 1 week ago, because everything is changing every day. Now, as I mentioned, Russian economy is really going back in time. Foreign companies exit en masse. This is something that, again, Russian government probably didn't appreciate. It wasn't prepared for that. And as we speak, the main action today in Russian policy making is how to take over assets of foreign investors. How exactly pick up whatever is left when foreign companies exit and leave the key on the next to the front door. So that is this voluntary sanction which hits Russia really badly. That, for example, will ground Russian airline industry. Aircraft need to be insured, leased, but also serviced. So even if you are not able to fly your Boeing to Paris or Berlin or Brussels, you will not soon be able to fly it within Russia because maintenance will not be there. Russian government will say, we believe in Boeing's quality, so it doesn't need to be serviced. But of course, that is dangerous. That is really, really dangerous. The same is true with the semiconductors when firms that produce advanced technology, some of them cannot export to Russia because of sanctions, but some of them voluntarily exit. And most importantly, transportation companies and oil companies hit Russia with voluntary sanctions. So Shell and BP not just exited Russia and closed their gas stations in Russia, but also stopped buying Russian oil. And Maersk stopped transporting Russian goods, including commodities. So that really hits Russian oil revenues. And so if you ask about numbers, inflation is really picking up. Ruble has lost about half its value. We don't know how much because no longer ruble is in convertible currency. Stock market lost a lot. We don't know how much because stock exchange has been closed for more than a week and is probably not going to reopen in coming weeks. So it's a bit a strange environment. 2 weeks ago, Russia had a modern financial system, modern macroeconomic system. Today, comparing Russia to Iran or Venezuela, we should remind ourselves that these countries seem to have stock exchanges. It's only North Korea doesn't. And so it's really a surreal environment where Russia was a modern country just a few weeks ago, and now it's back to 1990 or 1991. And that, of course, results in major suffering of people. People say, well, only oligarchs suffer. Some other people would say, no, the main impact is on the middle class. I disagree. I think everybody suffers. If you're an average Russian who makes just enough money to buy food and medicine, and these are the two major goods you need to spend your money on, apart from communal utilities and stuff, food will become much more expensive, and medicines will probably be twice as expensive in ruble terms as before. And of course, the question is whether Mr. Putin will have fiscal resources to compensate for that, and the answer is probably not, because of those voluntary sanctions on Russian oil and the continuing discussion on oil and gas embargo in Europe. The US embargo has already been introduced, but this is not as important as US buys very little Russian oil. But unless there is a broader embargo, Russia continues to get oil revenues, and in terms of flows, both in terms of balance of payments and fiscal balance, Russia will do reasonably well, given how high oil prices are. So this is a brief summary of where we are, and I'm happy to elaborate on any of those points in more detail.
Well, Maria, perhaps I ask a question. I mean, I think this is fascinating, and of course, as you say, we are economists, but we also have our hearts. And so yesterday, I had a long conversation in the same forum here in a podcast with Oleg Ustenko, the chief economic advisor to President Zelensky. And of course, the whole situation is an absolute tragedy, and it's really an unnecessary tragedy because it has been driven by Vladimir Putin and not by Russia as a whole, but really by the regime. So I guess I want to ask you sort of two questions. I think the economics of what you describe are fairly clear. Perhaps I have two more political questions, but I do want to ask you, perhaps before we come to those two political questions, a bit more on the economics still, because there's still, I guess, a lot to be said on the sanctions. And perhaps you can just dig in a little bit more deeper into how the sanctions are affecting the Russian economy. And I mean, I think really of two main things. I think you mentioned already the firms exiting. I think Yale University has a very nice list of the companies that have already exited. There are also export bans on technology, microchips, high-tech goods. I think these things will really bite quite significantly into the Russian economy. But then there is the big elephant in the room, which is, of course, the embargo or the import stop on oil and gas, which hasn't been fully decided yet everywhere, and which is actually going to be not so easy to digest in some European countries, but which I think is on the table and I think will eventually come. So tell me a bit about how you think about the sanctions overall, but also what possibilities does Putin really have to redirect the exports of fossil fuels to other places, because the most important revenue is oil, and oil is just being put on ships, and the ships can go everywhere in the world. And in a world that's hungry for energy, as soon as you have some significant discount, I tend to think someone will buy it. So what's your estimates really? How much will this bring down the revenues of the Russian state?
So Guntram, you're exactly right. So indeed, sanctions sometimes work in the long term. So not having access to technology, not having access to foreign direct investment is a long-term thing. Another long-term sanction that Putin effectively imposed on himself is brain drain. So Russia's always suffered from brain drain, but in the last 2 weeks, that's really accelerated. A lot of people you and I know have just closed their apartments and just left without any job, without any plan, just left because they thought that maybe in 2 weeks it will be too late. And their suffering is not comparable to suffering of Ukrainians being bombarded by Putin's planes and rockets, but still, that is also a long-term problem for Putin's regime. However, that's now a different game. Before the war, the West told Vladimir Putin, we'll impose devastating sanctions on you. Please don't start this war. Mr. Putin told them, I will not start the war. I will never invade. I promise you. But even though the markets priced in some sanctions, if you look at ruble and Russian assets, you see that before the invasion, Russian ruble and Russian stocks already lost quite a bit of value. The sanctions which came after the invasion are different. The first few days we're talking to Putin, telling Putin, please stop. Once it was clear he is doubling down, indeed, the next round of sanctions, especially sanctions on the Russian central bank, were sanctions that were to cripple his economy, cripple his ability to pay for this war. And now this is what's going to continue. And since the idea is to stop the war here and now, the question is to stop his ability to pay his army, but also pay his policemen who beat up protesters, anti-war protesters in Moscow, because this is a war on several fronts. And one of them indeed is in Ukraine and the other one is at home. And as we speak, Putin's dictatorship is being transformed from a dictatorship based on information manipulation, on spin, as we call it in our book, Spin Dictators with Daniel Trisman, to an old-style 20th century dictatorship based on fear, like Hitler's Germany. And I'm very happy I talk to a German now, because you can understand the parallels better from looking at this not just as a victim of Hitler's aggression outside of Germany, but also thinking about ordinary Germans inside of Germany. Now, as you rightly said, the question is whether oil can be redirected. And this is where those private sanctions played a huge role. And then the next question is how much of the oil is pipeline oil versus fungible oil. And so the question is how well the West can negotiate with China. So China doesn't buy too much of Russian oil, and how the West can introduce secondary sanctions. And the one example is Iran, but we shouldn't forget how much bigger the outrage is against Mr. Putin around the world than outrage has ever been against Iran. Iran is not a nice, Iranian's regime is not a nice regime, but the atrocities we see today in Ukraine, much closer to Europe, actually generate a lot more pressure on Western politicians. And I think there is a much more united West, and not just the West, which will go after companies and people who want to buy Russian oil. And in that sense, if Europe joins the embargo, there'll be a coalition which will try to enforce this embargo in a much better, stronger way than any other embargo in the recent history we've seen. So the question is indeed for the European politicians, because until Europe introduces the embargo, you cannot enforce this embargo in developing countries. And now the next question is, of course, to talk to the other oil producers, Saudi Arabia, Emirates, Venezuela, Iran, the very same Iran. So if there is a deal, Iran will produce more to reduce the burden, not just on Europeans, but also on developing countries. Maria mentioned that I was a chief economist, European Bank of Reconstruction and Development. We think about the hit on European households, but developing countries, especially commodity importing developing countries, which will be hit a lot more. And so part of the burden for the developed countries will also be to provide subsidies, provide aid to developing countries which are hit by this shock. So this is not an easy situation. But once again, we are in 1939. If you have a time machine and you go to 1939 and you know what's going to happen next, will you be willing to impose oil embargo or not? Or will you be willing to keep giving cash to the aggressor so he can continue building his war machine and continue killing innocent civilians in the neighboring country?
Yeah, so this is an essential question, right? And one that we are going to have to we'll be confronted with this question for some time now. That is absolutely essential. But I wanted to ask you, so we've seen financial sanctions, we've seen trade sanction, we're seeing foreign firms are leaving. the speed. I wanted to ask a question about the speed. How quickly we are moving into dissolvement of the economy, of the Russian economy. What's the speed that this comes into a halt?
So it is really fast, yeah, and indeed situations changing every day. What is also important, what is unthinkable becomes reality. This is something that many of us did not expect. So sanctions on a central bank of Russia. A lot of people thought it's impossible, it's never happened. Actually, it's happened to Afghanistan and Venezuela and Syria. But Russia was a normal country, member of BIS and country with huge reserves. So that was unthinkable, and yet it happened. The same is going on with the exodus of foreign companies, and that changes every day. And as I said, in 2 weeks, Russia went back 30 years in terms of being disconnected from the world, not having financial markets, having a black market in dollars. Actually, yesterday, you were asking about the speed. Yesterday, suddenly central bank put a statement on its website, not signed, not explained, not backed by any legal references, just saying, we, from now on, don't allow Russians to buy cash dollars. And then they say, if you have a currency account in a Russian bank below $10,000, you're allowed to take dollars out, even if your account is in a different currency. This is something which, again, something is beyond me. And then if you have more than $10,000, you can take $10,000 in dollars, and the rest will pay you in rubles at the official rate. And the official rate is already different from whatever the black market rate is. The difference is about 20%. So it's a reality which changes every day, and the policymakers are improvising, which also shows Mr. Putin prepared this war within a very narrow circle, didn't tell his economic team. Economic team was taken by surprise, started to improvise, did not get prepared. And so that is something which, again, changes every day.
If I may, the one thing that is actually, of course, is not imminent, because we are talking about the short term, the speed, when is this coming to an end? But the types of things that are happening now, and I actually see a lot of questions that come in the direction of that, is that the long-term implications for the Russian economy, they're extremely devastating. I mean, you're talking about a real decoupling here of the Russian economy. The technological sector will leave an incredible gap. So it's not just about sorting this out and then we're coming back to normal. It's about litigations, for example, is some of the assets that are being seized by foreign firms. All of these will go to litigation when and if things come back to normal, right? So you are talking about a mess that's going to be with us maybe for a decade or maybe beyond that.
That's exactly true. I think the biggest loss is the exodus of human capital. And if you think about, for example, companies like McKinsey leaving, or PricewaterhouseCoopers, PwC, and all the consultants are leaving, all the banks are leaving, all the sophisticated foreign companies are leaving. Russians who work for those companies, and we are talking about thousands of Russians working for each of those companies, are probably best trained, motivated, and entrepreneurial Russians who will leave Russia or move to other less advanced sectors, and that is a big shock to human capital. How Russia is going to develop after Mr. Putin, it's very hard to imagine. But again, there is a very clear historical parallel, 1945. And if Russians get their act together after Mr. Putin, if there is a free democratic Russia, I think there'll be willingness on the rest of the world, not just to have Russian assets to go and help Ukrainians, which apparently is going to happen. Russia is a rich country and will contribute to reparations, to reconstructing Ukraine, but also there'll be help to Russia, to rebuild Russia, especially if there'll be commitment and confidence that Russians will be able to stick to new democratic institutions. Now, Germany has become a bulwark of democracy, freedom, and market economy in Europe after World War II, and I don't see why Russians can do that. To say that Russians are genetically predisposed to dictatorship and state control would be something that Hitler would say. This is a Russophobic statement that I'm not prepared to make.
Right. I mean, of course, there's more than genes. There's also tradition and history and culture.
That's true. That's correct.
That
That's
plays a
correct.
role. And but you know, I really want to. I mean, we can speculate about a sort of a post-Putin Russia, but that's, I think it's very speculative because Putin is in charge, and you know, he runs the military police state, and in my understanding, he also controls the key assets, and many of the oligarchs will be worse off if he leaves than rather than better off. So in that sense, perhaps in the short to medium term, I'm not so optimistic. So I guess the question I want to ask you, the more political question is, and I was asked that question yesterday, given how well Russia and the Russian economy had developed actually in the last 20 or 30 years, and you know how also the macroeconomic management was a cautious management, and you know really rebuilt buffers and ran reasonably responsible fiscal policy and really rebuilt Russia in many respects. Given that all of that happened in the last 20 years, why did Putin put that at stake? Did he not expect the response that he got, or did he just think? You know, I watched very carefully his speech when he started the invasion, and you know, there, I mean, he very much. I mean, there's a lot of propaganda in that speech, but the one thing that I actually believe, the way I read him, that he believes in is the fear of NATO expansion. So is it that he just thought, okay, this NATO expansion overrides everything else, the risk of NATO expansion overrides everything else, and I'm ready to risk everything? Or did he just not expect that kind of response? Or how do you read his political decision making?
So a lot of people say that Putin has changed and has been isolated, and he's no longer rational. And you know, in Europe, there are many former friends of Putin who now are forced to say whether they keep supporting Putin, especially on the extreme right, far right part of political spectrum. And many of them say, Mr. Putin used to be a nice guy and we were friends with him, but he's changed now. So it's a different person, said Silvio Berlusconi. But honestly, I think watching Putin too much, watching Putin speeches too much is too much, because he's a KGB officer and he can, his speeches are to recruit you, to convince you. And that's what he's been trying to do. Now, we should watch Putin's actions. And so there are two things. One is he thought he needs this war to boost his popularity, like he did in Crimea. That really worked. And I think it worked. It not only worked beyond my expectations, I think it worked beyond his expectations as well. And this is where, Guntram, you're completely right. Culture, traditions matter. And Russia still has this post-imperial syndrome, and Russians loved annexation of Crimea. And so Putin did that and really benefited. Now, after Crimea, his management of the economy resulted in stagnating incomes, in lack of growth. Russians' real incomes are still about 10% below 2013 levels. Even before the war, they were. In terms of real incomes, Russian households were poorer than in 2013. And so Russians were growing more and more unhappy with Mr. Putin, and Mr. Putin wanted another Crimea, right? He thought it would help. And then he expected that it would be another Crimea. So the war would finish in a couple of days. He would take Kyiv, replace Ukrainian government. He also thought that Ukrainians would love him, would welcome him. And then you ask a question, how come such a smart, pragmatic person made such a miscalculation? And this is also not a bug, but a feature of a system like Putin's system. He eliminated dissent, he eliminated debate, he didn't like people who disagreed with him. And so he only got yes men telling him, you're the greatest and the whole world loves you, including Ukrainians. And our army is one of the strongest armies in the world, and the West is weak and disunited. And I think the main trigger was Afghanistan, which suggested to him that the West is weaker than people think, and the West will not stand up to him. And some of that is misinformation from his own people. And they are afraid to stand up to him, to criticize him, to disagree with him. And so this is where it gets. And another thing is corruption. A lot of money spent on the army were stolen. A lot of money spent on recruiting Ukrainian elite was misspent. Now there is a debate among Russian anti-Ukrainian, pro-patriotic, quote unquote, segment, which says, how come Ukrainians don't like it? The Kremlin spent so much money on building pro-Kremlin parties in Russia. Actually, the pro-Kremlin party in Russia recently said, this is an invasion. We call for all our members to join territorial defense, which is kind of national guard in Ukraine.
But can I ask, continuing the logic of this question, miscalculation? I mean, this is a miscalculation. What is the end game here? Because I mean, you're confronted now with two wars with unexpected response from everybody, including the Ukrainians, of course. Where does this end? If this is a miscalculation, the end must be very, very near.
Well, so we should not also be driven by our own information bubble. So Ukrainians have a lot of compassion, and they are obviously winning this information war, especially outside of Russia. Within Russia, you only get Russian propaganda unless you have a VPN. All independent media were blocked after the invasion. The dissent is now officially criminalized. If you're a journalist and you write about the war of Ukraine, either you communicate official version of events or you go to jail for up to 15 years. So in that sense, within Russia, there is no dissent. But outside of Russia, a lot of people have wishful thinking in the sense that Ukrainian army is stuck, but that doesn't mean that the war is over. The fighting is continuing very near Kiev. For me, it's also a personal dimension. I lived in Kiev for 12 years. I have many friends there, and all these places which are being bombed, including places where I physically lived in Kiev, that is very near. And the war still continues, and Putin may still take Ukrainian cities. I don't think he will win a war, even if he replaces the government and takes Kiev. That would be another Afghanistan, and this is the war Putin's army cannot win, because Ukrainians hate Putin, and they will keep resisting, and they will get arms and support from the West, and eventually it will end like Afghan war ended, probably sooner. There is also an option for negotiations today. Russian foreign ministers meet in Ukrainian foreign minister meet in Turkey. Hopefully there'll be a ceasefire, and my hope is that in a couple of weeks, if there is no change on the battleground, there'll be at least a ceasefire and people will stop dying. How Putin negotiates the exit, I don't know. He needs to go back to Russian people and say, all this economic destruction was not in vain, and I brought you something. As long as he doesn't go back to pre-war status quo, a lot of sanctions will remain in place. And definitely exodus of foreign companies will not be reversed, because as long as Putin is in the Kremlin, the West will expect him to continue this aggressive foreign policy. But essentially, the end game now is decided by Ukrainians. This is something I would emphasize. This is actually a very, very important point. So a lot of Russians I talk to now say, I feel so bad because I feel powerless. I feel I cannot do anything. I feel no agency. And this is what countries between Germany and Russia often complain about. They complain about their future being decided by somebody else. There is this book by great historian Tim Snyder called Bloodlands, talking about all the Central and Eastern Europe between Germany and Russia being invaded by either or both, partitioned, divided, brutalized. And this is the feeling of these countries. And now we see that Ukraine does have agency. Ukraine does change course of history, and that may actually change the end game completely. And so Ukrainians
while Russian citizens do not have agency.
Exactly.
And I think a very important difference here. The Ukrainian citizens do have agency, Russian citizens don't.
And that's why we should all support democratic political systems, not dictatorial political systems.
So Sergey, we are getting already a lot of questions, and perhaps we can already start asking you one or two questions from the audience, and people are really interested in our conversation. But one question is on on sanctions and countries, the effect of the sanctions in countries in the South Caucasus. Could it be that Russia reorients trade with Armenia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, and others? That's one question. Well, I mean, perhaps we take them one by one, but perhaps this, no, let's get one more which is related, which is again on this technological loss for Russia. You know, how easy will it be for Russia to substitute its technological loss by relying on Chinese technology, by fostering localization, or by hacking the sanctions like Iran did? So these are two questions more on the economic front. And then there's many other questions which we will ask in the second round.
Right. So Russia will try to reorient trade, but of course, South Caucasus countries are not a solution. The real solution would be China. And indeed, China can provide a lot of goods that Russia imports now from Europe. Europe is still Europe before the war was the biggest Russian trading partner. Whatever pivot to China Russia's been talking about since 2014, Europe is still the biggest trading partner. But Russia hopes it can get a lot of goods from China and investment from China. There is this analogy that many of you have probably seen on Twitter. Russian government froze the situation in the stock market, froze the situation in the currency market, and people show this photo of a cabinet where you have China, meaning pots and plate and cups and plates, which are falling, and you can see in this picture when you open the door, that will be a disaster. All the China will break, and they say when you reopen the market, you'll probably discover that your shares are 80% down, 90% down. And so I was asked by somebody, so what happens? What is their game plan for opening this door? And this is exactly the solution. So Russian government thinks that there will be no oil embargo, there will be carve-outs for energy exports. So in terms of dollars and fiscal revenues, if you are able to export oil and there is hacking of the sanctions like Iran did, that will solve the currency and fiscal problem, and the technological trade import problem will be solved by China. Not the China in terms of cups and pots and plates, but in terms of China, the People's Republic of China. And this is the hope. And this is why, if you want to stop this war, you need to think about stopping the oil revenues and cooperating with China, bringing China on board somehow.
Right.
And some of that is cooperative and some of that is somewhat hostile. Americans are very serious about secondary sanctions, very serious about secondary sanctions.
I mean, perhaps just to complement what you said there, I mean, just to give a proportion, I mean, for Russia, the EU has been the main export market, more than 50% of exports, while China is more around 10, 15%. So redirecting already that will be close to impossible. And at least in the short term, and hoping, the other point I wanted to make is hoping for China to save Russia would require, I mean, even without secondary sanctions, China is also interested in making money. And the latest news we are hearing is that, for example, sales of technological products to Russia have been already reduced very significantly by Chinese companies. And we've also seen that, and we've written on this as well at Bruegel, we've also seen that Chinese banks actually have complied already with sanctions and have stopped providing dollar currency, et cetera, to Russia. So I mean, I think, yes, the Chinese might support, but the Chinese also want to make money and certainly don't want to completely burn their fingers here because they're so intertwined with the West. So in some respects, I mean, this we might see a bifurcation of the global economy with Russia and China moving closer to each other. But if that happens, China will dictate the terms on Russia, and it might not be very pretty for Russia. So what's your take on this bifurcation, on this discussion?
So I fully agree with you, Guntram, and I think China will be much less supportive of Mr. Putin. And that's another miscalculation. I think, by the way, that the fact that Putin didn't start this war on February 16, as it was initially planned, and delayed it until China's Olympics were over, that really helped Ukrainians because of the thawing ground and so on. Russian tanks are literally stuck in mud right now. In many places, they have to use roads. And if you have several hundred vehicles on the road, that's not as effective. We are now, I don't know, last year, everybody was an epidemiologist. This year, everybody's a military expert. But I'm struck, there is a convoy near Kiev, which is 50 kilometers long, right? So it's something that was eventually driven by Mr. Xi, who asked Mr. Putin to delay the invasion. So Chinese leader talked to Chancellor Scholz and President Macron about his next steps. You rightly said that biggest Chinese banks, ICBC and Bank of China, have complied with Western sanctions. Another thing which people have not noticed, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and the New Development Bank froze Russian operations. That's especially striking for the New Development Bank, where Russia is one of the 5 founders, apparently on an equal footing with China, but still. So China is not very excited about what's going on in Ukraine and will probably be very slow to support Russia. On bifurcation, a lot of people also say, and this I think is close to what Bruegel is doing in its work on global economic governance, global financial governance, that the sanctions against Russian reserves will push other central banks in China and Turkey, wherever, away from dollar and from euro. But the question is where? The question is, how soon will yuan replace dollar? And the answer is not soon, not soon. And so a lot of people would say that weaponization of dollar and euro is risky, and it is risky, but it's not going to happen soon. But what will bifurcate is the payment system. Sorry. We see that SWIFT can be weaponized, and so China will build its own payment system and probably will join forces with Russia. Russia's already built a system which is much less developed than SWIFT and even Chinese system. But today, Russia has not stopped, exactly because since 2014, it's been built a Russian substitute for SWIFT, which is not comparable in terms of size and sophistication, but still it functions already.
I just want to stay a little bit with China, because if I understand you correctly, you believe that China is much more part of the solution than part of the problem, because they want to make money and therefore they won't be causing troubles. And yet, it seems to me that China choosing whether to be part of the problem or the solution gives them incredible leverage vis-a-vis the rest of the world. I mean, if you could just take a contrarian view for the minute, just for the sake of argument, how could the Chinese use the current situation with Russians to extract rents on other issues?
Maria, this is an excellent point, and that brings us back to 1945 or 1941 this time around. So Stalin's regime was not a nice regime, I can tell you. I've done research on this. We have a survey of recent research on Russian economic history coming up and accepted for publication, Journal of Economic Literature. And there we have table 1, where we bring together all the repression done by Stalin to its own people. And we're talking about big numbers. We look at people who were shot, imprisoned, deported, and so on. This was not a nice regime. But then in the 1940s, Americans and Brits said Soviet Union will be part of the solution. And that's probably a wrong analogy, but it's still an analogy. So sometimes you have immoral but necessary decisions. And so it will be very hard for American president who came to the office saying, China is a problem, Russia's not a problem, to completely reverse cause and say China is part of the solution and Russia is the problem. And so this is going to be a serious negotiation, and I guess Bruegel is better positioned. You have a special podcast on China, and so I think this is where we should look for solutions to the problem, how China can be a solution to the problem. So I think there people who know better than I do will tell you what kind of benefits China will get out of this mess. I don't think it will be betraying Taiwan by the US. I don't think so. But definitely China will get something out of that, suggesting that we agree to help you to stop Russia. So don't do this and this to us.
So Sergey, we are actually having 27 questions, which is really showing the interest, a huge interest. And I do want to throw two more at you, just to give justice to our audience also. So one is about regardless the current war, doesn't the West carry some responsibility for all of this? One argument that the author here makes is because also the West didn't invest in Russian democracy after 91 in another Versailles moment. So this is one question. And another question is on perhaps more in our field on whether you think Russia will actually default or not.
That's an easy question. Rating agencies already rate Russia as an imminent default, and Mr. Putin already said that if you're a creditor coming from an unfriendly country, which means a country that imposed sanctions on Russia, you will be paid in rubles through a special account. So this is default. So, and this is in a sense, it's a default of choice, in a sense that if oil embargo doesn't happen, Russia has cash to repay that. And actually, Gazprom just paid its bond or coupon, I don't know, a couple of $1 billion. Rosneft didn't, but Gazprom did. So in that sense, Russia has already started to default, but I think this is not the biggest problem Russia has, or the West has, or the global economy will be hit. So Russian debt is actually very small. You mentioned the competent macroeconomic management. Before the war, there are 4 elements of that. One is reserves that I mentioned. The other one is low debt, 20% of GDP. Even after the pandemic, Russian sovereign debt is 20% of GDP, and very little of that is actually external. The fiscal rule and the budget, which also allows Russia to say, if oil price is at $100 per barrel, we are doing extremely well. The initial forecast was that the break-even price would be $44 per barrel. Now, things are not that easy because $44 per barrel are based on the forecast that Russian economy grows at 3% a year in 2022. Now, with a minus 10% GDP performance, the budget will have a much bigger hole. So $44 will not be enough. And the fourth element, it was inflation target and flexible ruble exchange rate, which is out of the window by now. So in that sense, default is not what worries me. So coming back to your first question, remind me what it was, please.
Well, it was sort of the question.
The guilt, yes.
And what about investing into democracy and Versailles?
Yes,
nice.
That's a great question. And so I also have a piece in Journal of Economic Literature discussing those issues. It was a review of the book of late Gorbachev's economic policy by Chris Miller. But I also lay out my views on this particular issue, and I show which mistakes were made by Gorbachev government, but also by Yeltsin government. And also I suggest that one of the biggest issues was, first, Russia assumed Soviet debt, which Poland didn't, for example. And this was not smart and unfair because Soviet debt was a debt assumed by a non-democratic government, created by non-democratic government. Why should free Russia pay? But the other thing was indeed the lack of Marshall Plan for democratic Russia. And I actually tried to figure out why. And there is a piece by Carl Bildt, written, I think, in 2015 as an introduction to a book, where he actually explains, and Carl Bildt is a person who understands Russia extremely well, like many people in frontline states, right? So Carl says, well, we tried to mobilize funds, but US was busy because it was an election. Power was moving from Bush to Clinton. Japan was thinking about an opportunity to negotiate the islands. And Germany was busy with the unification. And so nobody thought about those issues. Now, there is a lot of wisdom. There are lessons learned. And I direct you to the European Parliament's report on Russia, led by a special rapporteur, former Prime Minister of Lithuania, Andrius Kubilius, who put together a group of people and produced a report which was published in September 2021, before the war. And this report actually talks about those issues and says we need to do better this time when Putin is gone. And yes, I think there will be a Versailles moment. You're right, Guntram, that now when people are dying in Ukraine, maybe it's not the most important issue to talk about, but I think this mistake should not be repeated.
Again, staying with the questions, there's actually one question that I wanted to ask myself when I see that our audience is asking this, and that is the cost of the Russian war. We have seen some very crazy numbers, and indeed we see here also 20 billions per day. Can you help us think a little bit about the size of this number? I mean, what is this number about? Is this the stocks? Is this the flows? I mean, it's impossible to understand. 20 billions per day would have defaulted to Russia immediately. That can't be right.
So I don't know. Unfortunately, we are all busy, and there are many estimates coming up. And so this particular estimate I heard, but I didn't understand where it's coming from. It may include the total shock on the economy. If that is the case, then I think it may be true in the sense that the amount of wealth destroyed by Mr. Putin's war within Russia is huge. But the total Russian military budget is 60 billion per year. So 20 billion in terms of military expenditure per day or per 2 weeks sounds wrong to me.
Yeah.
But also Russia is very good in banning information. So Russian defense budget, we have the total number, but there are also military expenditures outside of military budget. So we really, and then the military budget itself is secret, officially secret. So we really have no clue. And on top of that, of course, a lot of money is stolen. So it's something where I would direct you to military experts, and I'm still trying to stick to my economic competences. Yeah.
Sure.
Even during COVID, I won't talk about genetic aspects of vaccines.
That's right, very wise. So perhaps we can then, I don't know, Guntram, if you had a question, but there is some questions coming in about the EU.
Well, perhaps we do the last questions really on the impact on the EU, and then we conclude, because the class is already running long.
Exactly, that I think is right. So let's see it from the EU side. I mean, you have already said how important it will be the oil sanctions and the gas sanctions as a instrument of stopping the flow of income coming in. We're having very important discussions coming on today, and you've seen the discussions on defense. It's an remarkable U-turn in the way that the EU and Europe, in broadly Europe, thinks about how to react as a result of what we've seen in the Ukraine. How do you see the future of Europe? What should we do, or perhaps could afford to do, given the war in Ukraine right now?
So this is the question I will ask you, but and I think Bruegel is much better positioned than I am to think about the changes in defense, changes in energy policy, changes in fiscal rules. You know, European leaders are now meeting in the very same Versailles now, discussing fiscal rules. Some of our audience are probably too young to remember that Europe used to have fiscal rules, but no, I'm not talking about you guys. I know that you remember Maastricht, but
we are not so young anymore. So
yes, nobody's getting any younger. But I think there will be tectonic shifts, and one of the things that we know now is that European economy will get a huge hit. So there are now estimates from some investment banks that in the first half of 2022, Euro area will go into a recession. That is the moment where we thought we have this fast recovery from COVID, right? So European leaders understand how costly things like this are. And so that's why there'll be more defense, more discussion of strategic autonomy, but also more unity with NATO. I think there'll be a change of public opinions already happened in Sweden and Finland. And so there'll be tectonic shifts, which probably Bruegel researchers are better positioned than them. I've already read your paper on preparing for the next winter without Russian gas. And I think there'll be more papers coming up, which is extremely, extremely important. But I think the acceleration of getting rid of Russian gas, whether it will be a green scenario or a coal-based scenario, that's a different question. But there'll be both, big shifts. Yeah, it can be both. And definitely will be nuclear. But overall, I think EU will change a lot as a result of this. Well, don't forget that the EU was created after 1945 to a great extent as an implication of the war. And I think this war, hopefully not as dramatic, not as painful, already very tragic, but not yet comparable in terms of degree of destruction, will also create a better and stronger EU.
Yeah, but if I may, the EU was a peace project. And
the EU was a peace project, exactly. But it was created after the war to create peace. And I think,
we mustn't. I mean, all of this to say that the future must not exclude a scenario of disarmament, because I mean, more armament, which is effectively the direction we are going, is of course the defensive part, is the escalation part. But in my view, we mustn't forget the history. Since you have put all this discussion in historical perspective, disarmament cannot be, in my view, a no option. It has to be part of the thing to discuss. Otherwise, 60 years of peace are being thrown out of the window, right? I mean, it's really quite sad to see that the armament is the solution to it, which of course it is in a defensive sense, but it cannot be the end game.
So one thing I would say is I'm not a military expert and a strategy expert, but I'm a political economist. And as a political economist, I can tell you that this war will bring attention to a very important issue. Dictatorships are costly, not only for their own citizens, but for the whole world. And dictatorships have changed a lot in the 21st century. This is where I again advertise my book with Daniel Treisman called Spin Dictators, which is coming up in early April in the US and in June in Europe, where we actually talk about how these dictatorships function and how to confront them. And that's not easy at all anymore, because many of them pretend to be democracies. And Mr. Putin has pretended to be democracy quite successfully for quite a while. And so this is going to be sophisticated. It's not just armaments, it's also enforcing rules, fighting corruption, fighting money laundering, building better, stronger political system in the West. So lots of things that need to be done. And again, fighting the information war, which as we see can turn into a real war. Even Guntram listened to Mr. Putin and was convinced. So I think was convinced that Mr. Putin is honest.
I was just saying on this one point, the one point on the NATO thing, I mean, I feel that this is something that Putin probably feels very strongly about.
I think we are all, but we're all serious people, and we know that NATO cannot attack Russia because Russia has nuclear weapons. I think there is no question about this, and everybody understands this. And thinking that Mr. Putin is so crazy that he doesn't understand that is a bit too much. So I think that's a bit too much. But yes, Mr. Putin is trying to use propaganda, and he tries to use censorship. Previously, before the war, it was covert censorship, hidden censorship. Also censoring information on censorship itself. So Russians don't understand that they live in a censored country. But that also resulted eventually in this miscalculation. And I really think that this war in Ukraine has significantly shortened the life of Mr. Putin's regime. And so this mistake is also an implication of this model that suppresses dissent. So in that sense, I think out of this war we'll also take away our views on dictatorships and the need to confront them. And unfortunately, today's world, by different estimates, There are some estimates that 40% of the global population lives in non-democratic regimes. But if you look at some other estimates which think that India is already not a democracy, the number would be very different. Majority would live in non-democratic regimes. So this is a big battle to fight after this war.
Okay, Sergey, thank you so much for having accepted our invitation and for this very nice and frank conversation about a very serious and difficult topic that I'm sure will keep all of us busy for quite some time. Thank you for your insights, and thank you, Maria, for co-hosting. It was really a pleasure to be here with you.
Thank you, Sergey.
Thank you very much, Guntram. Thank you, Maria.
Thank you.
Thank you. Looking forward to reading more and better and deeper Bruegel analysis. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.